Tales for Dark Nights.
Windfalls, written by Bennie Newsome, narrated by Jonathan Jones. Ever since the beginning of time, when God first came upon the face of the earth and banished darkness into the deepest corners, there has always been evil. A malevolent force bent on revenge against the great being of light in his creations. Being the all-seeing entity that he is, God recognized this evil and knew its intentions, so the Almighty established two bodies of light, the sun, and gave it authority over day, and the moon, a lesser light that watched over the night. The sun performed its duties to perfection. It kept the darkness at bay. However, that moon, well, let's just say the moon is a fickle thing. It is constantly sleeping with its eye half open. Even when the moon is fully awake, it does a poor job of keeping the darkness away. Then there are times when the moon doesn't show up at all. Oh yes, that moon is a fickle thing. And sometimes I question its allegiance. Andrew Smith could see the full moon at the edge of his peripheral. He had been grateful for its presence when darkness first descended, but for some unexplained reason, the young man had grown wary of the celestial body. The moon seemed to follow Andrew, and he knew his suspicion to be crazy thinking. The way the moon appeared to focus on him made Andrew uneasy. Therefore, he found a bit of relief when it disappeared behind the first set of raw constructed buildings. Ghost town, Andrew muttered. A line of interconnected buildings stretched along his right-hand side. A similar set of buildings also set on his left. Together they formed a town that rested in the middle of a forsaken desert. Andrew gripped the front of his wide-brimmed gambler's hat and tilted it upwards so he could have a better view of the wooden establishments. His brown eyes searched the darkened windows for any signs of life. As he walked on, nothing stirred within the buildings. Another one bites the dust. Ghost towns had become a regular sight for him as he made his way from the prejudiced South, looking to make a new life in the Northwest. Settlers from all over the United States were rushing towards the new frontier, hoping to find a prosperous life. Many had created settlements like the one Andrew stumbled upon, and after finding the land inhospitable, they had moved on. There were numerous ghost towns strewn across the Wild West. Andrew's dusty black boots clunked against the hard ground. A warm wind blew through the town, causing his rifle frock coat to billow about his ankles as he strolled down the street of what the slanted welcome sign dubbed as Windfalls. Because of its small stature, Andrew figured the town was a trading post in its heyday. He could feel the light weight of his satchel hanging from his shoulder, a blatant reminder that he would have to search the town for provisions come morning. His trip had taken much longer than he had expected after having to put down his horse, North Star. The poor thing had twisted its ankle in a concealed hole out in that barren wasteland. A lame horse was nothing more than a hindrance. So Andrew did what he had to do. With his trip extended, his supplies barely allowed him to make it to Windfalls. More important was that his body demanded sleep. Andrew made his way to the nearest building for some well-needed rest. Is it possible that the moon is a sentient being? Let's say the moon is capable of having rational thoughts and feelings. Let's say the moon watched me on that life-altering night. It watched me as I entered the abandoned inn I chose for shelter. I remember being thankful for the moonlight that shone through several windows, helping me to find my way. I was thankful, but I should have been afraid, for that silvery moonlight was nothing more than the moon's attention fixed on me. It lost me as I made my way up a set of rickety stairs, but found me again when I entered a room on the second floor. I unwittingly made my way into its luminous light of sight, set my stuff down and made camp. I felt secure in the moon's glow, but what I should have felt was fear. Because let's say the moon hung there in the sky and watched as I inventoried my belongings, that the moon waited until I fell asleep before it grabbed a nearby cloud and pulled it across its face. I have no idea if the moon is a sentient being. I do know for one reason or another, the moon hit its face and evil was given free rein. An hour after Andrew fell asleep upon the floor of that abandoned inn, a mysterious wind blew through the desert, pushing along the few clouds that hung in the sky. One large cloud in particular drifted across the starry background until it blocked the light of the moon. Then the wind ceased just as quickly as it started. The wooden buildings shuddered. Rusty wind chimes cried out in alarm. Skeletal hands lifted from fissures that appeared on the main street of Windfalls, jutting upward like devilish plants. Bony arms followed hands, bent at the elbows to push against the ground in order to elevate their bodies. Skulls appeared, and those ghastly craniums groaned as they hauled themselves from their unmarked graves. After the dirt-stained skulls came necks, then spines and rib cages, and finally the pelvic bones and legs. In moments, dozens of skeletons looked around as if familiarizing themselves with their environment. The skeletons stood in silence for several seconds. Another gust of wind swept the land. Great clouds of dust rose up and swirled around the rattling undead. Dirt clung to their bones, thickening until it made putrid flesh. The evil forces at work appeared to be using God's recipe for creating mankind, but with horrifying results. Rancid meat and tattered skin now covered the skeletons, making them nothing more than zombies one might hear talked about around campfires. Although the real McCoy was much worse than anyone's imagination could conceive. The ghastly zombies staggered about, testing out their recently formed limbs. They moaned as a way to exercise their vocal cords. The first zombie found his voice. It was an unearthly sound, chilling to the bone, and its first words were, A loud whooping noise pulled Andrew from his slumber. His eyes snapped open. He remained on the dusty floor, staring up at the ceiling, listening to his surroundings. He heard a multitude of voices from outside. What's going on? Andrew considered the possibility that a band of ruffians had come along. Needless to say, such an occurrence would not bode well for him. Ruffians were merciless to anyone not part of their gang, and the fact that Andrew was a colored man would only make matters worse. Oh Lord, I need your protection. He pushed his blanket aside and rolled over onto his knees. He crawled across the floor until he came to a stop in front of the only window. Ever so slowly, he lifted his head and peered down to the street. Old lanterns gave light to the town, and it was by these lights that Andrew was able to see people moving about. Men with debonair attire and women wearing fancy dresses strolled up and down the main street, entering and exiting buildings. They did not appear to be ruffians, but there was no doubt that what had been a ghost town just a few hours ago now brimmed with life. Andrew questioned his eyes as he stared down at the people going about their business. Did a caravan decide to hunker down for a spell just as he had? His thoughts were interrupted by muffled whispering and giggling from just outside the door. He spun away from the enigmatic scene below and fixed his eyes on the splintered barrier to his room. Andrew's heart pounded furiously. He waited a few minutes hoping that the people would go away, but the playful conversation continued. He scrambled across the dusty floor and proceeded to gather his belongings, throwing them into his satchel. He hastily dressed and scanned the floor once more to ensure he had not forgotten anything. When satisfied, Andrew crept to the door. He placed his ear against the wood and listened. The flirtatious conversation tapered off, only to be replaced by sloppy-sounding kisses and sensual moaning. All I have to do is walk out there like I belong. How are they to know I don't? Andrew took a deep, steadying breath, then opened the door and stepped into the hallway. A hermit crab is a creature born weak and defenseless. It comes into this world without a shell, without a home. Because of this, a newborn hermit crab must find a shell. The crab does not craft a shell of its own. It comes across the remains of a dead sea snail and moves in. One creature's death aids to the continuance of another's life. Now, with that said, consider the demon. Much like the hermit crab, demonic creatures are weak and defenseless when they first enter the land of the living. Without a vessel, they are nothing more than shades. So their first task is to find a shell absent of its previous tenant. For a demon cannot create one of its own. I admit, the thought had never occurred to me before I came across Windfalls. The place was an empty shell filled with a demonic presence. Exiting the room, I did not look at the couple and think that they were empty vessels filled with evil. No. When I stepped into that hallway draped with cobwebs and coated with grime, I was offended at how they halted to stare at me. "How you fine folks doing this evening?" I asked with a nod of my head. I tried to ignore their stare as I strolled past them, but in my mind I was experiencing the very racism that had forced me to leave Alabama. I walked down to the saloon on the first floor. Lantern light illuminated the room. Tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey permeated the air. As soon as my boots touched the landing, all activity froze. The card game being played on the far left corner of the room halted. The pianist stopped tickling the ivories. The bartender stopped performing his duties, and every patron paused their conversations. All eyes focused on me. Racist bastards, I thought, an understandable reaction considering the circumstance. I had intended on leaving as fast as I could, but once confronted with such a disrespectful display, I chose to stand my ground. Every man is created equal, and by God, I was going to get the respect due. I cringe with shame when I think about how my pride nearly cost me my life that night. Andrew gazed about the crowded room. He was an unwilling stage performer standing before a captivated audience. Eventually, the surprise he experienced from their coordinated actions wore off and was replaced by outrage. They acted as if they had never seen a colored man. Andrew figured if that was the case, he would be more than happy for them to make his acquaintance. He recomposed himself before sauntering over to the bar. The sound of his boots clopping against the wooden floor was the only thing to be heard. "Good day to you," Andrew said happily, addressing one of the slack-jawed men seated at the bar and receiving no response. Oh well, he claimed the splintered bar stool stationed to the right of the rude fella. Once seated, Andrew removed his hat and set it on the counter. He looked to the burly barkeep. "Whiskey on the rocks." The man cleared his throat. "We ain't got no ice." Straight will do. Whiskey straight, coming up. And as suddenly as things halted, everything resumed. The patrons returned to their conversations. Cursing and raucous laughter erupted over at the card table, and the piano began emitting a lively tune. Andrew looked over his shoulder, watching everyone go about their business. It was as if somebody blew a whistle that he couldn't hear. Something ain't right. The bartender slammed a glass on the countertop, returning Andrew's attention forward. 2 coppers, the brute said. Andrew pulled a silver piece from his purse and slid the coin over to the man. Keep the change. Much obliged. The bartender reached for the silver coin, and when he did, the cloud covering the moon shifted. Perhaps the winds of fortune blew in, or the moon felt a twinge of guilt. Whatever the reason, a ray of moonlight broke through the overcast and entered one of the establishment's dirt-stained windows. The luminescent beam highlighted the dust motes in its path and rested on the bartender's hand. Andrew watched as the hand transformed from grimy flesh to nothing but bones with tattered, decayed meat hanging from it. The shaft of the moonlight only lasted a few seconds before the silvery disk was covered by clouds once more. The saloon became quiet, causing Andrew to slowly glance to his left. The slack-jawed man stared directly at him with a ravenous look in his eyes. Andrew turned his head to the right and saw the same expression in the eyes of the other men along the bar. I guess I'll be moving along. His statement was interrupted by the barkeep lunging towards him. The man wrapped his hairy hands around Andrew's neck and yanked him over the counter. Andrew's flailing legs kicked his stool over. Drinking glasses flew and shattered. The bartender slammed him down where his head thumped hard against the floor. Andrew's vision wavered. His hand fumbled for his holster. The bartender loomed over him. The zombie's mouth opened wide, bearing rotten teeth. Slobber dripped from his gaping maw, and the stench of death wafted out. It unleashed a heart-wrenching roar before rushing forward. Quickly pulling his revolver up to the zombie's chin, Andrew cocked the hammer back and pulled the trigger. Brain matter and blood sprayed his face as the barkeep's head exploded. His eardrums rang from the deafening shot. There was no time to be repulsed. Andrew pushed the collapsed body away and climbed to his feet just in time to see the other zombies hurrying across the room, the majority of them already clambering over the bar. Come here, boy, one yelled. Andrew shot off a hand that reached for him. He sent another bullet into the monster's head, sending it crashing to the floor. 3 more headshots fired. 3 more fell. Andrew holstered the smoking pistol and removed a second gun. In the midst of changing weapons, he watched the undead rush the bar like it was happy hour, and he was the only man on duty. Andrew cursed. He hopped onto the bar, stomping a hand beneath his boot, snapping a zombie's head back before it collapsed. Andrew raced down the length of the bar. When he reached its end, he leapt over the horde, coat flapping behind him and knees raised high to avoid the extended hands. He landed before the saloon's double doors and rushed right through, running full speed down the steps and then halting with his attention focused on the open desert beyond Windfalls. He began to move in that direction, but his nearly empty satchel brought him to a stop. Damn, supplies! Andrew scanned the buildings lining the main street and noticed that all activities had stopped. The women held the hems of their dresses out of the dirt, but they no longer walked. The men also stood paused. Much like in the saloon, the town had grown quiet. Every pair of eyes focused on him. I miss when they were just racist, he groaned. The saloon doors exploded and Andrew's drinking buddies rushed out. The zombies standing in the streets quickly charged in his direction. Despite his frantic mindset, Andrew managed to spot a decrepit general store. He sprinted to the opposing porch and burst into the dimly lit shop. "Can I help you?" Pow! A bullet tore through the head of the old man standing behind the cash register. His knees buckled and the counter's edge cracked his skull. Andrew sprinted over to the dust-covered shelves without missing a beat. He came across some grimy canned goods with no labels and tossed them into his satchel. The rusty bell above the shop's door jingled. Andrew spun around to find the undead spilling in through the entrance. He raised his pistol and fired a shot, knocking one unholy creature to the floor, temporarily plugging up the doorway. Andrew hurried over to the cash register. Jars were positioned next to the machine. He reached into one and removed some jerky. He grabbed a handful of rice from another container and some dried beans from a third. The shop quickly crowded. A fluttering lamplight caused their shadows to dance upon the wall. Before attempting an escape, Andrew knelt behind the counter to reload his revolvers. His trembling hands dropped a couple of bullets.
Damn it!
He retrieved the stray rounds and loaded them along with others into his pistols, then clicked the barrels into place. Andrew took a deep breath, said a prayer, and hopped up from behind the counter like a jack-in-the-box springing out of his prison. Andrew cocked the hammers on both pistols and pulled the triggers. The two zombies nearest to him fell. Andrew climbed into the counter and fired 4 more rounds before jumping into the crowd. Decaying hands took hold of him. Andrew wriggled out of his coat and moved forward. A mob stood before the door, gnashing their teeth and groping. Andrew fired 2 more shots. The aroma of spent gunpowder filled the air. Shrugging off hands and kicking away bodies, Andrew made his way outside. Both hammers cocked back again, and the zombies that fell allowed Andrew to break through the mob. Only 2 more bullets, Andrew reminded himself. Everyone in town appeared to have gathered at the general store. He cut past them until his path to freedom was unobstructed. He raced along the dirt road, heading towards the edge of town. All Andrew had to do was pass beneath the slanted welcoming sign, and he would be home free. 100 yards became 80, then 60, then 45. The distance standing between him and the exit of the godforsaken town dwindled. The zombies fell further and further behind. Then Andrew noticed a watering trough off to the side and came to a sudden stop. He glanced back at the approaching mob and then to the watering trough. He only had 2 bullets left, 1 per revolver. Knowing he wouldn't last without water, Andrew hurried over to the trough. The zombies were 80 yards away. He laid his pistols down and removed a nearly empty canteen from his satchel. 70 yards. Andrew unscrewed the canteen's top. Come on, come on, come on! His heart beat furiously in his chest. 50 yards. When the top came undone, Andrew took hold of the water spout's handle and pushed down. The apparatus creaked, but no water came out. Please! The dead were only about 35 yards away. He picked up one of his pistols and fired it at the crowd. 1 zombie fell. Many more continued onward. 1 bullet left. Andrew lifted the handle and pushed it back down hard. Nothing. He said another prayer as he lifted and lowered the handle once more. A drip of water spilled into his canteen. His heart was on the verge of busting from his chest. Only 20 yards separated him from the zombies. There was no way he could get the water and escape. 10 yards. Andrew picked up his pistol and fired his last bullet. That lone round did not factor into his survival, but 1 less zombie would be feasting on his innards. He dropped the pistol and resumed pumping. A great deal of water emerged. His next draw from the faucet brought even more, and it was not as brown with rust. 8 yards. Andrew frantically screwed the cap onto his canteen. 5. The stampeding undead were finally upon him. Their teeth chomped hungrily, hands stretched outward in hopes of being the first to feast. In one quick motion, Andrew shouldered the canteen and swept down for his guns. 3 yards. I should have saved a bullet for myself. The lead zombie tackled Andrew to the ground and the rest piled on, wrestling for a taste of flesh. Andrew screamed and thrashed with every bit of energy, but the weight was too much. He gritted his teeth and held his breath to keep from inhaling the rotten aroma. Get it over with, Andrew thought, and let his muscles relax. Just then, a ray of sunlight peeked over the horizon. As they began to rip into him, Andrew closed his eyes and prayed. But for the third time in less than an hour, the zombies halted. Tendrils of smoke rose from their eyeballs as they stared at that wink of brilliance. Suddenly, their flesh burst into flames. Painful howls emitted by the undead caused Andrew to close his eyes even tighter, preventing him from seeing the zombies dissipate into clouds of ash and dust and bone. Andrew lay beneath the skeletal remains, body in the fetal position, hands covering his head. When he finally opened his eyes, he peered through the bones and saw the sun chasing away the last bit of darkness. Can't say for certain if the sun and moon are sentient beings, but that morning, as I clawed my way from beneath the hill of corpses, I developed a new respect for that fiery orb, which rules the day with an iron fist. And as the weakened moon slunk away with the fleeing darkness, I developed a suspicion. Andrew Smith,